Hello, everyone. This is Jed Disler, and welcome to the Chopin Report. I'm still in Warsaw for a few days, but since our Chopin Report production crew have finished with their commitments for the time being, I'm going from professional to rank amateur. I'm recording this episode on my laptop with a little USB mixer and my trusty Sennheiser microphone. You see, I don't yet have a clip-on mic, which would make life much easier. So this is totally old school. But I thought it would be sad not to keep the momentum going that we've established over the past 12 days. And so I decided to devote this episode to recordings of the Chopin Polonaises. And I'm going to focus on individual recordings that I like for each of the so-called standard Polonaises, meaning the ones with opus number. And I'm going to do so without repeating a pianist on this list. Most of these choices are historic recordings. That's a spoiler alert. Now, just to talk a little bit about the Polonaise, of course, it's a traditional Polish dance, although you find examples of Polonaises in the music of Bach and Beethoven. You know, the Beethoven Polonaise Opus 89 in C major. That's a really wonderful piece. I really like that. Is the mic covering my nose? Probably should be like this, but I'm reading off of the script. I have cue cards because I can't talk about any of this spontaneously. But anyway, it was Chopin who refined and expanded the piano polonaise into a very substantial form. And he began to write polonaises, I think at the age of 7, and he continued writing them throughout his brief life. But we're going to start with the first two published polonaises, Opus 26. The first one of these is in C sharp minor, and it begins with a rhythmically intense descending group of forte octaves that lead into a passionate theme in C sharp minor. And then after some virtuoso arpeggio phrases, there's a very lyrical second theme in E major. And the central section is in D flat major, which is the enharmonic equivalent of C sharp minor. Forgive my use of technical terms, but enharmonic, you can look that up. Now, one recording of this work, the C sharp minor Polonaise, that I especially love is a very dramatically contrasted yet well unified reading by Sergio Fiorentino, a great Italian pianist. His Polonaise cycle, recorded around 1960, had its ups and downs, but this particular work, Opus 26, number 1, really finds him at his best. Talking about the Opus 26, number 2 Polonaise in E flat minor, there are these repeated figures at the start, which are quiet and ominous, but then you listen to how they build up and become more and more agitated, and then they build into this very passionate opening section. And then the central section, which is sort of a militaristic theme in B major, it has all these little silences. And Chopin was on really inspired form when he composed this work. Also inspired very much so in his recording of this piece is the veteran pianist Ignaz Jan Paderewski, or Ignaz Jan Paderewski, sorry about that. He recorded this Polonaise in 1930, and this was when Paderewski was getting on in years. And many of the recordings that he made when he returned to the concert platform after his stint as the Prime Minister of Poland do show a kind of falling off of technique and more rhythmic eccentricity to compensate, perhaps. But everything clicks in this Paderewski recording of Opus 26, number 2. And it is true that the tempos are a little bit on the careful side, but if you listen to this recording, and I've provided links to these recordings in the YouTube description of this episode, you'll notice his projection and his beauty of tone and his total idiomatic understanding it's all there. This is one of his greatest recordings, in my opinion. Now, number 40, number one, of course, is the famous military polonaise, dum ba bum ba 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 bum ba bum, which I'm singing in the wrong key and my scratchy, sleep-deprived voice. And everybody knows this piece as background music. It's one of Chopin's greatest hits, and almost every great Chopin pianist of note recorded it. Now, the question is, what recording should I recommend? Because there are just so many. I wouldn't recommend Paderewski, actually, his 1917 recording. Not very good. I keep coming back to Maurizio Pollini's recording on Deutsche Grammophon. It's a performance that has incisive and crisp rhythm, clean articulation. Of course, you expect that from Pollini. And it really addresses Chopin's allegro con brio marking. Now, can one play this piece in a slower way with more gravitas? I think a good example of this was the Polish pianist Witold Malkuzinski. And he really was a wonderful Polonaise player. It's kind of old school, for lack of a better word. This is a pianist who doesn't get that much attention now, and there have been reissues of his recording. So if you want that grandiose A major Polonaise, Malkuzinski is the way to go. But for con brio and for technical sheen and stylistic surety, I would recommend Pollini. Probably the second Polonaise in this set, Opus 40, number 2 in C minor, is the least played of the published Polonaises, at least in concert. Its dark and brooding main theme doesn't exactly make you sit up to be a patriot the way the A major Polonaise or the heroic Polonaise does. And if you take all of the repeats, this piece does feel a little bit too long. And when I want to include this piece on my radio show Between the Keys, I usually look for a version that doesn't have a lot of repeats or maybe doesn't have the repeats. But that's not the only reason that I am recommending a recording made in 1958 by Samson Francois. I'm recommending this recording because he confronts the music's darkness straight in the eye, and he brings out a lot of the music's harmonic tension. His earlier recordings of the Polonaises, the 1958 cycle, by the way, is far and away much better than his remakes from the late 1960s when he was really on his way downhill artistically. Although there are some good later Samson Francois recordings, don't get me wrong, but this 1958 Opus 40 number 2 C minor Polonaise with Samson Francois, definitely give it a try. I think that Chopin's Polonaise in F sharp minor, Opus 44, that we heard often in the competition, is just one of his greatest compositions, period. It's like a 3-act play in my mind. And it has that central mazurka episode that leads into those shocking upward scales that in turn lead back into that main theme that recapitulates. Now, if you know me well, and if you've seen my commentaries on recordings for my friend Ben Lottie's Chopin podcast, you know that no one beats Vladimir Horowitz in this piece with his televised Carnegie Hall program from 1968, the recording from that program. Now, we do have several other Horowitz performances of Opus 44 from the same period, but it's the one that was released officially on that Horowitz on Television album that I recommend. Probably it was edited between various rehearsal and performance takes, but that doesn't matter because what an intense and pulverizing conception. And all of those little Horowitzian touches, the upward octaves that he slightly rushes for very electrifying and dramatic effect, I mean, I'm not going to sing that. but this is a great recording and definitely listen to it. So now we get to the famous heroic Polonaise in A flat, opus 53. Again, everyone and his brother, everyone and her sister recorded this. And, this composition was so closely identified with Arthur Rubinstein that we would have to recommend one of his three studio recorded versions, right? Wrong. I'm going to go for another historic recording, and this one is by Joseph Levine. He made pitifully few recordings for a pianist of his stature, but listen to his recording of the A flat Polonaise. I mean, his fantastic technique, his big tone, and the staggeringly secure left hand octaves are all in a class by themselves. But there is a sense of reserve and a kind of classicism that's heroic without being overly emotive. I mean, when you hear somebody like Yevgeny Kissin in his Verbier performance with his tempos going all over the place, I mean, it sounds like he had studied the work under candelabra, if you know what I mean. As for the great Polonaise fantasy, Opus 61, since we already recommended Horowitz in Opus 44, I can't recommend him again. Remember, we're not repeating a pianist. Although his live Carnegie Hall 1966 performance is still one of my favorites. So I'm going to turn to another remarkable and complex virtuoso, the Ukrainian-born Sviatoslav Richter. There are way too many live recordings to count with Richter in the Polonaise fantasy. At least 12 of them have been published on CD or on commercial video. Probably the best played and best sounding of all of these is a live performance from Milan in 1962 that was on Deutsche Grammophon. And Richter's concentration and his sense of long lines and his total technical control and his way of proportioning rubato like a conductor, where it's not lurching, it's very gradual and very thought out. I think all these elements bring real drama and cohesion to a work that is not really easy to organize and to bring across. Now for the Andante Spinato and Grand Polonaise, Opus 22. I suppose we can go back to Arthur Rubinstein's HMV version on 78s, but again, those of you, those of you who know me, you know where I'm going with this. And I talked about this on Ben Lottie's podcast also. That's the Joseph Hoffman 1937 live Golden Jubilee concert performance. And who cares that he makes little cuts, because I think this piece is just too long and too repetitive, but don't tell anybody I said that. Hoffman takes the andante at a really nice clip, and the independence of contrapuntal voices makes it seem that he's playing this piece on two different pianos in two different rooms. And then once the Polonaise kicks in, his basic tempo is not too fast, but this tempo allows for more rhythmic kick and swagger, and for the right hand filigree to transpire with the most incredible precision and articulation with little help from the sustain pedal, and a fantastic sense of what should be in the foreground, what should be in the background. I mean, the specificity of detail in this performance makes most other pianists sound like students. Well, that's not kind to say, but it makes them sound thick. And interestingly, there's a live 1944 Hoffman performance from Carnegie Hall, but it's not as good because his playing had started to deteriorate a little bit. And it's interesting to make the comparison. But that 1937 Golden Jubilee performance, wow, wow, wee. And by the way, check out William Young's performance in the Chopin competition of this piece, because I think it's very much on this level, although very, very different. So I've talked about the Polonaises in individual recordings that I like very much. And check these out. I've provided some links, and I'm curious if you have favorite recordings of the Polonaises or if you disagree with my choices. Maybe there's some that I don't know about that you want to direct me to. So I'm very open to that. So this is the Chopin report, the first one that I'm recording here on my home amateur equipment. And if we continue these Chopin reports, we will do some video and audio upgrading, but I just want to keep the momentum going. And I want to thank you for all of your comments and all of your feedback. That's been so gratifying and really encouraging. So until next time, stay well and be kind to one another.